Good morning. This is Meg Riley here in Minneapolis, Minnesota, where we are waiting for a huge snowstorm, which should dump a couple of feet of snow on us this weekend. Hopefully not before I get on a plane and fly to Mexico, though. I'll be spending the next month down in Mexico City and San Miguel de Allende, but still here doing business and being in Mexico, which I'm quite excited about. Michael, what are you up to?
Good morning, everyone. This is Michael Tino from Peekskill, New York. It's I think finally spring here in New York. It is actually going to be 74 degrees here tomorrow, so you can come to New York on your way to Mexico if you'd like. Peekskill, for those of you who don't know, is a mere 40 miles north of New York City, where lots of my colleagues were last week, and I'm sorry I didn't get to see any of them. And one of those folks is Christina. So good morning, Christina.
Hi, good morning, everybody. Christina Rivera. I'm coming to you from Charlottesville, Virginia, where it is finally officially spring after the snow we got this weekend. But it's supposed to be 80 today, so we're going right into spring. And I'm sorry, I missed you, Michael. If I had known you were so close, I would have driven up. So yeah, I was at Revolutionary Love, which is a conference that's in its 12th year sponsored by Middle Collegiate Church there in Manhattan. And so I will say that what I found really interesting about it was, number one, the number of UUs that were there. At one point, I think I counted over 50 UUs, which really speaks to me as to what it is about the conference that is really feeding people and making them interested. And that's something that we want to pay attention to, is there as part of representing the Board of Trustees. And part of that is understanding where people are at with their racial justice, faith formation identity. And this conference really gave me a wide sense of where we are, collectively as interfaith work, but also as Unitarian Universalists. Like every conference is, different people experience it different ways. And I would say that that was true with this, particularly amongst UUs of color, and that there was some problematic, in my opinion, centering of whiteness. A lot of the conference felt like the audience was presumed to be white, although the audience was very mixed. And so a couple of times, actually, one of our co-hosts who isn't here today, Aisha Hauser, because she is serving our faith at the Religious Educator Credentialing Committee today in Boston, also kind of raised that. I asked a couple of questions. Lena Gardner from Black Lives Unitarian Universalism asked a couple of questions, because it really did feel like a large portion of the conference was centering whiteness, and we wanted to, broaden that. And there were some fabulous panels that really got us there, the final days of the conference. So I found it a really valuable and interesting experience, and I hope to see more folks there next year to kind of experience that together.
Were the 50 UUs who were there from several did multiple congregation, or was it just random people?
So it's in my experience, and what I've been told is over the years, some years the UUA has actually co-sponsored the event. And that we have also had over the years, like teams from congregations actually go. So 15 people from a congregation go. And that wasn't the case this time. It was really, just from everywhere. And that's one of the things that really kind of I was paying attention to was the fact that it wasn't just, UUs from New York or New England, where we have a higher concentration of UUs and you'd imagine would come to a conference in New York. I mean, there were people that were traveling. There were people from the East Coast, from the Pacific Northwest, from the South, from the Midwest. There were people who were putting personal resource into getting themselves to this conference in a way that makes me pay attention.
And was it a lot of religious professionals, lay leaders, both?
A lot of both. which is also great to see. Lots of folks that I recognize from being in Allies for Racial Equity spaces and religious professionals of color, but also just a lot of lay leaders who really felt like faith-based faith-based racial justice work is something that's important. That we aren't just showing up, and this is, a comparison that I make a lot. We're not just showing up for racial justice surge. There is a reason why, a theological reason and a faith reason why we are doing this work together in community. And that's, to me, what the better parts of this conference really addressed. And I think we need to pay more attention to that as Unitarian Universalists.
And so besides UUs, was it Christians or were there other faiths there too?
So primarily Christian. There was some Jewish folks, really much smaller group or contingent of both Muslim and Sikh folks. Sikh, I always pronounce that wrong. Folks there as well. So interfaith. I wouldn't say there was a whole heck of a lot of agnostics and atheists in the crowd, although I think those that were probably UUs. So interfaith in that aspect. But yeah, primarily there was definitely, I would say, a Christian, I wouldn't say Christian focus, as long as you felt comfortable doing the translation in your head as to however you experience the holy. I felt like people were fairly comfortable.
That's great. I haven't been for years. I went a couple times, and it was largely UUs when I went. That's kind of one reason that I backed away. So, but then this year I streamed some of it, and I was like, oh gosh, I wish I were there.
Yeah. I think that, when there's large groups of UUs there for a purpose, I could see how that could shift the feel of what was going on. If they were kind of intentionally trying to make this about themselves or about us. And I really appreciated that. And I really appreciated that it wasn't, that there was a larger space for a lot of other faiths.
Oh, that's great. We've been watching. Oh, go ahead, Michael.
Sorry, at some point, I'll make it there. It's interesting that you talk about people coming from all over the country to make it there and making it a real priority. And it's kind of funny to think that it's right down the road for me, and it just sort of happens in New York every year. So I hope to make it there, and I just want to reflect that as someone who watched it from afar and saw lots of people posting things about it. It was interesting to see how much of the Unitarian Universalist reaction to what went on there also centered whiteness in some pretty uncomfortable ways. So it made me want to be present and not part of the group of people experiencing it secondhand.
Yeah. And I will say, what I feel is important about that is that it really, we get so, I don't want to say siloed into how we're experiencing Unitarian Universalism, that I think it's important to know that there are other people who are experiencing it different ways and are at different places. And so how do we all still move together towards liberation? And so, while it's not great to experience white centering from a person whose calling is moving our congregations to liberation, it's good to know. That's a data point, if you want to call it that. That is good to know. But yeah, I will absolutely say, there were aspects of it that I was just like, whoa, wait a second. No, that's not the message that we want a whole room full of white, black, and brown people to go home with. And so thankfully there were, speakers like Tracy Blackman that were just like, no, we are not here put on earth to educate white people about how, our experiences is so that they can finally care enough to work for our liberation. That's not what our purpose on earth is. We may have individuals who are willing to do that work, But that does not mean that that is everybody's work. So.
Well, thanks. We'll talk more about it when Aisha's back, and because some of those speakers were saying really interesting things, as will our guests today. If you're listening to this on the podcast, you can't have been enjoying what those of us watching it have been watching Reverend Jason Lydon's face pop in and out and in and out. And I'm honestly not sure if he's here yet. But so I'm going to ask our guests to introduce yourselves, and not just with your name and your title, but share what you're actually doing a little bit, because each of you is doing different work. We're talking about prison ministry today from a wide variety of directions. And so, Karen, let's start with you. Your name and your role, but then not just like, here's my title, but really, what are you up to? And welcome.
Great. Thank you so much, Meg. I'm grateful for the invitation to talk about the work that we're doing here in Illinois and the Midwest region. My name is Reverend Karen Mooney. I am working with an new organization called the Unitarian Universalist Prison Ministries of Illinois. We formed about 3 years ago under the vision of young adult Megan Selby, who's been working, and a very good friend of Jason's, who's been working in the prison area, or prison, working with the abolition of prisons for, my gosh, I think so, for about 20 years. She was part of the group that brought forward the witness in 1999, I believe, to General Assembly. So she's was really passionate and was very excited about the potential of getting the word out about how to transform and or abolish our criminal justice system as it exists today out into congregations, and worked with a couple of other people to forward that message. I was brought on as a minister into their midst about 2 years ago. And what we've been doing over that last 2 years is spreading the good word of the work that is to be done. And I don't mean good word that the work is certainly good. It's a horrifying system, as I'm sure all of us know. And the statistics will live out, but really getting people in congregations equipped to be able to know what the work is and how they can become a part of a movement to transform the justice system that we see. And specifically, we're doing educational opportunities for people, preaching and forums, specifically trying wherever we can to forward the voices of those people who have an experience of the system from the very entrance of it all the way through to an eventual different relationship with it. I'm not sure that you ever exit the system once you have been introduced into it, but you certainly can get into postures of different relationships. So that's mainly the work that we've been doing. I've been doing work at both Cook County Jail and in, which is a larger, one of the larger jails in the United States, and down at the women's prison in Illinois, about mid-centered, called Logan. We're offering courses in both mindfulness and how to deal with trauma at Cook County Jail, and courses in restoring our lives at Logan. So that's who I am. Thank you again for this opportunity.
Absolutely. Mandy Goheen, want to introduce yourself and your work?
Sure. Mandy Goheen. I am the Director of Prison Ministry at the Church of the Larger Fellowship. And right now, one of the things I'm really excited about is not only our Pen Pal program, which is this ongoing undergirding of our prison ministry, but also reaching out to our over 850 members of the CLF who are incarcerated and asking them what their main justice issue is. And it's just been really interesting to get feedback from them in a different way. We oftentimes will pour education towards them and letters towards them, but what doesn't happen is we don't hear from them like what they think UUs need to know about their experience living in incarceration. I'm also going to be doing a workshop about the prison industrial complex and working in prisons in Nashville coming up on May 5th, and I'm really excited about that. And I've been doing a lot of preaching in small congregations in the South. I live in Montgomery, Alabama, so I'll be going to our home Unitarian Universalist this weekend and preaching about the CLF and our work. What else is exciting? Just the work of the prison ministry and the CLF and the way that we grow because of word of mouth from one person who's incarcerated to the next, and how they are really our evangelists for our program and for our faith. And thinking a lot about what happens when they come back into the free world from there. So that's what's going on with me.
You were here before, Mandy, when we did a session on testimony, and we talked about how our members who are incarcerated are so much better than our free world members at sharing the faith. And
yeah,
we just get letters all the time that are so profound. We got one yesterday in response to David Pyle's Quest article, a man who had been in solitary for 80 days. I mean, you know, and was writing a long, loving letter. And you just think, you know, wow, talk about needing faith. So they really are kind of our star constituents in the CLF, because they are doing spiritual practice
and ministering to us in ways that give me energy. Like I know this sounds silly, but I'm really excited. Tomorrow is my death row visit day that I get to go to Holman Prison here in Alabama, and once a month I get to sit with 3 gentlemen and visit and act kind of like a mama and feed them and listen to them, and we laugh and tell stories. And you know, you talk about solitary. Last time I was there, I asked the question, when was the last time you were outside? Because I am such a nature lover. And they said it had been 1.5 years since they had actually been outside. So they're supposed to be on 23-hour lockdown, and that's not the reality of their life. But what's interesting is they have such hope and such energy and such love to share. And I really am fed by that.
Yeah, I think it's worth saying that our prison outreach program is called Worthy Now. And do you want to share the inception of that name?
Yeah, Worthy Now. Everybody is worthy now of love and justice is sort of the motto behind it. And what we hope to do is build a community of Unitarian Universalists in the free world who are doing prison ministry that can network with each other and share ideas and share support around secondary trauma. That's the reality of working in this work, as we experience trauma ourselves, how to support each other and how to learn and grow, and how the CLF can get folks involved so that we can continue this ministry as it grows, because it is so exponential in its growth.
Thanks. Jason Lydon, I understand that you're here. We just can't see you. Is that right?
Correct. Hello.
We can hear you though. Welcome. Will you share a little bit about who you are and your work?
Absolutely. So I'm Reverend Jason Lydon. I am a community minister, recently relocated to Chicago after spending the last 34 years of my life in Boston, Massachusetts. Over the last 12 years, I've spent most of my time doing abolitionist work with an organization that I founded called Black and Pink, that describes itself as an open family of LGBTQ prisoners and free world allies who support each other. It's a nationally networked grassroots organization working simultaneously to abolish the prison industrial complex while meeting the immediate needs of LGBTQ and or HIV positive people who are incarcerated throughout the United States. And since moving to Chicago, I have joined the Unitarian Universalist prison ministry here, and it's been really great getting connected and building relationships with folks. Previously, I had helped work on curriculum and figuring out the best ways that folks on the outside, especially folks who haven't had experience being locked up before, can best engage in prison ministry. That as Unitarian Universalists, we have actually a long legacy in which prisoner justice is something that we have been connected to, whether looking at the history of people like John Murray, who helped found our Universalist faith in the US, was a formerly incarcerated person himself. And so for me, one of the things I imagine is for the way in which I do ministry is ensuring that our Unitarian Universalist faith, while challenging the enormous white supremacy that is the foundation of the US prison industrial complex, that we are also understanding the ways in which our community and our faith has been part of both being marginalized by this system, part of perpetuating this system, and the ways in which we have an opportunity to be part of dismantling this system now.
And am I making this up? Or I thought you were doing some work around HIV/AIDS in prisons, no?
That's correct. In terms of my job right now, I work with coordinating the National LGBT HIV Criminal Justice Working Group, which includes doing work with people who are experiencing criminalization because of their HIV status. In 32 states around the country, it is illegal to engage in sexual behavior as an HIV positive person without disclosing your HIV status. And there are an enormous number of reasons why people don't disclose their HIV status, and criminalizing that is certainly not something that is going to bring anybody closer to having a world free from HIV. Also, 1 in 7 people living with HIV will be incarcerated at some point in their lifetimes, not simply because of criminalization, but because if we look at the intersections of who is getting contracting HIV and who is being policed, these are the same folks, right? That as Unitarian Universalists, we're super active in the HIV movement in the 80s when people were paying attention to white gay men dying. Unfortunately, we have seen Unitarian Universalists fall away from doing the work around HIV as Black men, and particularly young Black men who have sex with men are the primary folks who are contracting the virus now. And we see our congregation really disappearing and having disappeared from the work over the last kind of 8 years, which has been very sad. But it is indeed the impact of HIV in terms of the prison industrial complex happens in many different ways, but really seeing the ways in which communities of color, Black communities in particular, are experiencing policing is then a big part of how then we're watching young Black men living with HIV getting incarcerated.
Yeah, Mandy, you mentioned soliciting information from people who are incarcerated about what they're concerned about with justice issues. What have they said so far?
I think that Jason, this is a really good transition from what Reverend Jason was saying, because the majority of folks that we're hearing from, access to healthcare is a major issue, and the cost of healthcare for people who live in prisons is just ridiculous. It's standing in long lines waiting to possibly be seen. They're still charged, many of them, for the healthcare, and anybody who would be part of a indigent population, someone without an income and somebody without a job in prison, wouldn't have the same access to healthcare that other folks have. So I think that along with access to mental health care, because we know also that the prison industrial complex is warehousing people with mental health issues who otherwise could have services and be part of our society in a different way. One person said that he had just a bronchial infection, and that he had waited in line 3 different days before he was able to access antibiotics. And even in that access, it cost, nearly a month's salary to get that medicine. And I think that also speaks to the fact of privatization in the industrial complex, because not only are some private prisons, the vendors in prisons, and that includes healthcare, are private companies. So you can be like someplace here in Alabama where it's a state-run prison, but the vendors who supply phone calls and access to the commissary and healthcare and a number of other resources are all private operations. And then we had the story of the guy here in Alabama who was getting money for giving corn dogs. He was a sheriff, and he was giving corn dogs to people for every meal. And that story is really widely spread. I heard about it from my friend on death row. He's the one that told me that story first, that he said, well, at least we don't eat corn dogs every day, but he does complain about the food. So the food is another private vendor that that prisons buy food from the local area. So really the way that the prison industrial complex affects the community around the prisons as well is really key in understanding. And one of the things that gets me is in these rural communities where there isn't much opportunity for work, this is one of the main employers in Alabama. And other places, of course, but I just am more versed in what goes on in Alabama.
Well, I think if you know what's going on in Alabama, it's helpful for the rest of us, because we're kind of all Alabama when it comes to prisons. The privatization issues. I read recently about how the bank cards that they were giving out for $250, you actually couldn't cash them ever. Karen, as you deal with reentry and congregations trying to help people who are coming out of prisons, are the economics the major thing that's important? Because I know that's really hard, but what else? What are the issues going on?
Yeah, the issues that we hear the most about are around housing and fair housing. So when we're going through and equipping congregations, we do some training to try to degauze what people think about is happening and what's actually happening for people. So jobs are a clear place where challenges come up and where a lot of restoration is needed. But the number one problem is housing. At least in Illinois, there are people that are actually on parole that are still incarcerated because they don't have an address to go to as they're coming out of prison. So you have a choice, and this is where our faith comes in. You have a choice of whether or not to put yourself into a housing situation where you may be of a different faith than the faith that's running the housing situation, and that can put you at risk for people looking at you differently and potentially putting you in the way of being sent back to prison. We had a story of somebody who didn't want to be part of an AA group because they didn't espouse a Christian belief, and the house that they were in were actively trying to send them back into prison because they said, you're not participating in our programs. And if you're not participating in our programs fully, and what fully means, that means that we're gonna put you out on the street. And of course, once you're out on the street, if you're on parole, that's it. You're actually not out on the street. You're back into prison for some amount of time. So I think that housing is one of the biggest issues that we see, secured housing. And also back to part of what you were saying, Mandy, about healthcare within prisons, is healthcare once they get out of prisons as well. Within prisons, there's they have potentially more access, even though it's expensive and it's ridiculous the amount of money that people have to pay as a copay, and some of the decisions that the state makes around how or who gets access to things like surgeries and stuff. Once people are out, they have the same challenges, and then the additional challenge of not always knowing where to find the healthcare providers that they might be able to gain access to, as well as how to sign up for access to those providers. So it's really complicated. But those are, I think, the thing that we're engaging with the congregations most is one, to preference the voice of those that are returning. They're the leaders of the solidarity circles that are set up out of congregations, and those people that are walking with that individual are listening to that individual for what their main need is, because obviously it will be different depending on the person.
Yeah, I know. And you know, as I've gradually learned just how biased I am, you know, I would be on Craigslist and I would see all these things that said, I need housing, I'm a felon. And I would think, oh, honey, don't say you're a felon. Well, I didn't know that if they didn't, they could be put back in jail for it, you know? And I'm like presuming my superiority, like, oh, they just don't know. Like, right, like they don't know. Like, no, you don't know, Meg. But I mean, so just learning the huge list, which has been, you know, now I've read them, but of the things that people have to do when they're on probation. And here in Minnesota, where our stuff is sometimes looked at by other activists as where they want to go, it sounds like, for me, talking to people here, it's the probation that really is so horrible here. I mean, there's just these lists. You can't, for some crimes, you can't have a cell phone. I mean, how do you get a job without a cell phone? You know, just, I don't know. It feels like the system is so set up to send people back, and the recidivism rates are so high because of that here and everywhere, that the system, well, we know with private prisons, they want people in because they pay, but also just in general, it does feel more and more like. So is your goal as you work with the congregations to really try to reduce the people who are going back in, and I would guess really wrestling with a lot of complex probationary guidelines, or not guidelines, rules, edicts?
Yeah, I think that every story is its own. Right, and every parole person who's on parole gets a sheet of things that they should do, things they shouldn't do, ways that they're supposed to be. And I would agree 100% that the system is set up in order for people to fail at their probation to get them to send back. And I think that there's a sense in which that I have that the supremacy that people have brought up, that white supremacy, like, feeds into that, because as we have to pull back so much of what it is that we assume is real or right about what it is we're seeing, and question absolutely everything that is being asked of somebody that's being released from a prison, or from somebody that's on parole. I think that and I think that's challenging for many people, because once you begin questioning the system, then you have to take a look at every piece of the system, and you begin realizing the lies that you've been living within, and, you know, who has benefited from those lies and who has not. Right. So I, as a white middle class person, have to come to my own understanding of why I shouldn't call the police when a crime happens, right? And what that means, and that it's part of a larger piece of abolishing a criminal justice system that has historically and today been so disastrous to people. But the other piece that I want to bring up here, and this is really related to people who are returning, is that this work begins today for anybody that is listening, building relationships with those people that they are in community with, however you define those communities, because it can't start from a place of, oh, I've had a crime and I'm going to go and ask somebody for help. It's the same thing for people that are returning, and for us that are working in solidarity with them. In order for us to be effective at this work, we have to have relationships before we are in need of them. So we have to be building those relationships now with people in our own communities, with people who will have resources that will help them, whether that's through jobs or through the ability to be able to offer free healthcare. Those relationships and those communities have to be centered now, so that when people, when we're working in solidarity, we have the opportunity to be able to draw on long-standing understandings and long-standing relationships in order to be able to move forward. And I don't think that our goal is to keep people out of prison, though that's a tacit goal, obviously, with any of the work that we're doing, is to keep people from being imprisoned in any way. But it's really to be able to stand with the person that is coming back into our communities from being imprisoned and saying, what is your goal? How do you want to deal with the mess that you've been deposited into, and how can we help you as free world people to be able to do that? Because sometimes that might be, I really want to get an education before I start a job, and it doesn't matter whether or not I think that's a good idea. We are standing with the person that is there and helping them to realize the freedom that they now have, as constrained as that may be, that they didn't have before. And that's, I think is part of a gift, and it has to do with that, with the preferencing of our, what does it mean to actually say that somebody is worthy of dignity? Yeah. Dignity is freedom.
Absolutely. Jason, is that part of what Black and Pink does as well? I know that there's a lot that goes on within when people are incarcerated. Does Black and Pink also do that kind of networking and community building after people are released?
Absolutely. Our local chapters, especially here in Chicago, do a lot of work with people who are getting out, providing support, housing, care, community. And for Black and Pink, the kind of ideology, and I would actually say theology undergirding it, is really recognizing people's humanity and really going after what Karen was saying, that following the leadership and the desires articulated by the person getting out in terms of what it is that they want and need. So many reentry programs are designed to push people into jobs right away as the biggest focus of, when people get out, you need a job. Well, the reality is that, especially somebody who's done, 7, 8, 9, 20 years in prison, the first thing, unfortunately, usually can't be a job, because people are so traumatized that the first thing that is so essential when getting out of prison is healing. Because when we look at our prison system itself, it's designed to completely dehumanize people. The focus that I've had on so much of this is really around sexual violence, and that people, everybody in prison is strip searched on a regular basis. The majority of people who are incarcerated were survivors of sexual violence prior to their incarceration. LGBT people inside are more likely to be sexually assaulted than not by both prison staff and other prisoners during their incarceration. So getting out of prison is part of a long process of healing. And the way our system is designed, whether people are getting out on probation or being put on electronic monitoring, we have 5 million people in the US who are on some type of community supervision. And what that's doing is actually creating giant open air prisons, right? It's creating, especially in Black communities, a huge number of probation officers, parole officers, and police coming in and checking in on folks. It is this electronic surveillance that knows exactly where enormous numbers of Black people are at any given time. And random small things like you're not allowed to charge your ankle bracelet while you're sleeping. So you have to be sitting still and charging your ankle bracelet at different times, because if you get caught doing it while you're sleeping, you can get violated for that and incarcerated. And so these systems are really designed to continue to dehumanize people once they get out, to continue to control and regulate Black and brown bodies, in particular queer and trans bodies, people with mental illness. And for Black and Pink, kind of the ways in which we've imagined doing reentry work is doing so simply focused on loving the person first, being part of efforts that they need around healing, and following kind of their direction of what is it that you need. And for a lot of folks, I agree with what Karen was saying. First and foremost, it's housing and getting people into a place where they can feel safe or safer as they're figuring out the next steps in their journeys. And what I imagine for us as Unitarian Universalists is figuring out ways that those of us who have space can begin to wonder what it would look like to offer a room for a week, a month, 2 months to people when they're getting out, to figure out what it looks like to really understand the beauty of religious organizing. And also one of the ways that Black and Pink did organizing was getting away from a social service model of these strict boundaries and these strict borders of, you can see me from 9 to 5, Monday through Friday, but rather figuring out how it is that we as people of faith recognize that visiting the prisoner as called from the Bible, or the language that we hear throughout the Quran of people returning home and coming and being cared for after war in particular, but thinking about that in terms of people coming home from the battle of surviving prison, that we welcome them into our homes and that we figure out ways to do that, that are nurturing, that are pushing our boundaries in a healthy way to grow, and that we can see the ways in which we can meet people's immediate needs while expanding our living into our faith.
So a question for all of you, just kind of building on what Jason said, and thank you for articulating that so clearly about walking with people as they're going through this journey, and how we show up matters just as much as showing up. So if we have congregations who are interested in beginning this work, what does that look like? How do they go about doing that?
I can take a stab at answering that. Well, I think that we can't underestimate how important building relationships with people before they leave is. And I think that becoming a pen pal, I know that sounds like an easy thing to do, but it's one step in that direction. And a story that I think is really important to share, and this is an idealistic story, I'm not saying this is how it happens every time, is a person in a congregation in Georgia became a pen pal with someone in Florida. And on his release date, the pen pal and his brother were waiting for him to give him a ride home. They had built this relationship over time, and they were waiting for him to give him a ride to his mother's house after he was released. Like I said, this is an ideal story, but what is so beautiful about what happens next is they invited him to their home to come for vacation. They knew, talking about healing, they knew that he needed a place to go on a vacation. Can you imagine like what a gift that is to be on a vacation after being incarcerated for 10 years? And then he talked to them about his dreams, and one of his dreams was to start an electronics business. And they gave him a micro loan to help him start his own electronics business. And he's been a real leader at the CLF as far as he has become a pen pal himself, and he is mentoring other folks who are incarcerated. Another way congregations can get involved is by supporting financially these the CLF and other prison ministries, perhaps getting hooked into either the Chicago or Worthy Now and learning about what it means to welcome someone who has been previously incarcerated is really important. How do we welcome them? You know, we already stumble when we're welcoming people of color, and we already stumble when we're welcoming people who might be called other. And so one of the things I have told the last congregation I preached at is take a good hard look at your Safe Congregations Handbook and see if this is limiting who can attend your church, and see what this is doing to build a foundation for welcoming, and how is it doing that. That's another way. Just jumping in, testing the waters. All this isn't for everyone, and so there are all different ways to engage. You can be a pen pal, do visitation, spread the word about what other people are doing so they can be supported. Invite me to come and preach, and I'm not too far from you, Christina, so I could come visit you all. And talk about the programs, and just getting comfortable and understanding what and how the prison industrial complex works is really important. And I'm putting a link up for Worthy Now so people can check out the classes that we have. We do online classes or in-person classes.
I'm wondering also about congregations that actually, you know, are located near prisons. I mean, you all two of you were doing work in Chicago, which is awesome. But you know, I think the congregation I serve is within 10 miles of two major prisons. The Bedford Hills Women's Correctional Facility is about 2 miles from the congregation, and Sing Sing Prison in Ossining, New York is maybe 7 or 8 miles in the opposite direction. I think, okay, these are major correctional facilities. Prisons. They're major prisons that I'll use try not to use the euphemistic names that the prison industrial complex picks for them. And I wonder, you know, are there CLF members incarcerated in those prisons? And if you know, is there a way for me to find that out as a minister? Or if there are people in my congregation who wanted to be pen pals with local folks, or actually maybe even visit.
Yeah, absolutely. We have the database of where everybody's located, and that's one of the things that we've kind of changed as far as programming went. It used to be that if you were a pen pal, it was with somebody across the country, and now we're really encouraging folks to become pen pals with someone who's nearby, so that as that relationship develops, if it develops in a healthy way, that they can start visiting. Another suggestion is look around at nonprofits in the area that do work in prisons and join with them in their work. There's a place in Alabama called Aid to Inmate Mothers, and they have all kinds of really cool volunteer opportunities. Sometimes as Unitarian Universalists, we can get through the gates easier if we're with a nonprofit, you know, a multi-religious nonprofit or somebody else. And the Aid to Inmate Mothers does this program called the Storybook program, where they go and record moms and dads reading stories to their kids. They do a video recording so those children can listen to those stories at night. And we have several people in our congregation here in Montgomery who do go and do those recordings, and that gives you like all kinds of opportunities to connect with someone who's incarcerated and also serve your community. So I really say look around and see what the nonprofits are doing and how you can plug into them and get your foot in the door, or, you know, become a pen pal. Once again, I can't say that enough.
And I also want to add for clergy specifically that there's a unique role that I think people can and should play. And you know, for myself, I only did a short 6-month sentence inside county jails in Georgia and a federal prison in Massachusetts. And during my time, I got a visit from a VUU minister when I was in Massachusetts who had never visited a prison before. She had never really, to be honest, not much about the prison system, but because she had known me as a youth, or actually her husband had known me as a youth, and she was clergy, and she came to visit, and the difference it made to have somebody of my own faith was so huge. And to have a faith as a queer person locked up, unfortunately, you're bombarded with right-wing, mostly Christian, super conservative, very violent theology. When I was locked up in county jail in Georgia, I was in a queer segregated cell specifically, and every Sunday morning they sent in this right-wing preacher on purpose. This was a very purposeful thing that the jail was doing, who would come in and tell us what an abomination homosexuality was, and would tell us that we were all going to hell. And he would be in the day room, and there was nowhere we could go. We couldn't get away from him and his preaching. And so to experience such religious violence and spiritual harm is a constant reality for those who are not part of a more conservative tradition. And so for UU clergy to go in and figure out a time and space to offer a theology that is all-encompassing and loving and caring and affirming people's inherent worth and dignity, and offering universalism, especially for those who are targeted for violence by these other traditions, I think is a really essential role that clergy should really be taking on, especially if you live within 5 hours of a prison. Like, you should really consider trying to get there at least once a month to be doing something.
I also want to thank you so much, Jason, for that. I also want to put a plug in. So we earlier last year, I had the honor of marrying two different couples at a facility in Illinois called Rushville, which is it's run not by the DOC but by Health and Human Services, and it's where people who have been were incarcerated for sexually violent crimes go after they have completed their jail time for further jail time. Anyway, but what I found when I was working there was that because I started a relationship with two of the people who were there, I was able to network with the programs person there, and now I can go to that prison and they will let me hold an informal group of anybody that I have a relationship with. So really being mindful of who it is within the prison that you can build a relationship with beyond the people that you're visiting, so that you can potentially have different relationships with the people that are staying there. I think that oftentimes that information is up online, but I want to offer also to Jason's point about go and visit, really important, that it's important to know what the laws are within your state around who can be in association with whom. And by what I mean by that is I can go into Cook County Jail and have interaction with anybody as a volunteer there, but because I'm a volunteer at Cook County, I can't go and visit people at Cook County. There's a distinction there that is brought forward. Same thing with the prison stuff. Within all of the stuff that I've been talking about, we are equipping and encouraging congregations to take on an active role with building relationships through pen pals, with building relationships through visits, with advocacy, with the potential of them stepping forward and having solidarity circles for people that are returning into our communities. But we are not, as UUPMI, engaging in that work because we are in prisons trying to offer a different kind of voice to the one that Jason was experiencing and that so many people experience, that must, just has to be countermanded someplace. The people that have a faith that doesn't fit into the constructs of folks that are oftentimes evangelical Christians just feel battered within that. And then when we hear those stories, but it's really important to strategize and figure out who can do the visit stuff, who's going to be able to do this, the solidarity circles, who's willing to take on the onus of building a program that we can actually take into the jails or prisons, knowing that that will then limit how much you can potentially participate in some of these other things, so that everybody has a chance to be able to give what they can.
So we're coming down to the close of close to the close. So I'm going to ask this question, and I know we don't have a ton of time for it, but a lot of the discussion today has been around supporting people that are in the system, coming out of the system, that type of thing. What does UU prison ministry look like in dismantling the system? So actually prison abolition and getting rid of prisons altogether.
So do you want to
hold on? I just want to start by saying that I think we need to have a whole show on that, because it's such a huge topic. So I just want to say that I think we need to come back and do a whole show about abolition of prisons. And Karen, I'm just going to ask Mandy and Jason to come in, because we just have a couple more minutes. So, okay. Mandy or Jason, do you want to?
I do want to say that the building relationships is what we can do. I mean, helping reduce recidivism and paying attention to how the system works, and you know, paying attention to politics, definitely. Another thing I want to say, just to go back to what Jason and Karen were talking about just really quickly, is I support many, many ministers who are doing visits. So in doing that, if you are ready to step in and step up and do this work, I'll talk to you on the phone about it. I'll help you with whatever you need. Now I'm going to hand it over to Jason for the other part, but I just wanted to make sure ministers knew that I was available as a resource if they're curious about starting to do prison visits.
I think thank you so much. I think key to work of dismantling and abolition for Unitarian Universalists is looking deep into our theology that says that there's nothing salvific about punishment after death. And then if we put that into dialogue with our humanism, that must remind us that there can't possibly be something salvific about punishment during life. And that punishment isn't the way in which we will experience transformation. And that we as Unitarian Universalists have a responsibility to dismantle any systems that are relying on systems of white supremacy that are designed simply to punish people for being other, because it's not about holding people accountable for violence, because that's not happening, right? Cops get away with killing people all the time. Sexual violence is rampant and people aren't being held accountable. Our prison system isn't protecting us from violence at all. It's a complete failure if that is what we imagine it will do. But rather, we have an opportunity as Unitarian Universalists to struggle for and create alternatives right now. So we need to be doing that work, figuring out, as was said earlier, what we do instead of calling the police, and what we're doing in our communities to address harm without that, how we learn about transformative justice models that have been offered by groups like Creative Interventions and Generation 5, and how we can learn from these things to create something different. And also remembering our legacy when it came to the abolition of chattel slavery. UUs were a little bit late. Our Unitarian and Universalist folks that we like to celebrate as abolitionists, many of them were reluctant abolitionists, and we must not make that same mistake again. Our responsibility to dismantle white supremacy is to be at the front lines of abolition today and not coming late to the party.
All right, Karen, last word.
My last word is bravo to both of you. That was greatly said.
It's great. Well, it's really exciting to hear about all of your work. And as I said, we want to have a number of conversations, one of which is about abolition, because I think it's something those of us at GA a few years ago saw a very painful and kind of uninformed conversation about it. So I think that, yeah, that is worthy of an entire discussion. You've each, I think all of the websites that you've mentioned are promoted over on the CLF page, and it's great work. I encourage everybody listening to this to take a step toward to take a move towards it, make a move towards it. And speaking of my ableist language that I just used, next week, our show is going to be about disability and ministry. And it will be Sierra Marie Garfeo and Teresa Inés Soto talking about disability and ministry, including the fellowship, the ministerial fellowship process. So that will be a great conversation. Thanks to all of you, everybody, wherever you are, have a great week.